Fox San Antonio's Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our
Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But we are concerned about the trouble and trend of irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first. Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous
To our democracy.
This is extremely
dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous
To our democracy.
This is
Extremely
dangerous to our democracy.
Balanced journalism that CBS 4
A synchronized
News produces.
script
We are concerned about the trouble and trend of irresponsible,
on dozens of local news stations. Same words, same message. Mandated by the same station owner, Sinclair Broadcasting Group. Tonight, the corporation behind that commentary, defiant and digging in after this video posted by Deadspin went viral. In an internal memo obtained by NBC News, a Sinclair executive lists its journalism awards, and in a statement to reporters writes, "We find it curious that we would be attacked for asking our news people to remind their audiences that unsubstantiated stories exist on social media." Some critics see it differently.
It's odd to see all of these anchors saying the same thing at the same time with the words that have come out of one central location in Baltimore, Maryland. That's not our tradition in the United States. It smacks of propaganda.
The broadcast group, which skews more conservative, owns or operates more than 190 stations, including 15 NBC affiliates. 2/3 of those stations are in Trump country. Sinclair's connections to the administration include former White House staffer Boris Epstein, a Sinclair political commentator.
Millions of Americans staying at home are relying on Amazon.
Millions of Americans staying at home are relying on Amazon.
Millions of Americans staying at home are relying on Amazon.
Millions of Americans staying at home are relying on Amazon.
Amazon has transformed its operations in response to COVID-19 to protect employees and keep packages flowing.
Amazon has transformed its operations in response to COVID-19 to protect employees and keep packages flowing.
The company is keeping its employees safe and healthy while still delivering those packages to your doorstep.
The company is keeping employees safe and healthy.
The company is keeping its employees safe and healthy.
The company is keeping its employees safe and healthy.
The company is keeping its employees safe and healthy.
The company is keeping its employees safe and healthy.
The company is keeping its employees safe and healthy. The company is keeping its employees safe and healthy.
It spent $800 million on increased wages and overtime pay during the pandemic.
It has spent $800 million on increased wages and overtime pay during the pandemic.
It has spent $800 million on increased wages and overtime pay during the pandemic.
It has spent $800 million on increased wages and overtime pay during the pandemic.
Amazon says it has spent $800 million on increased wages and overtime pay during the pandemic.
Every single one of Amazon's workforce of nearly 1 million people has played a critical role in making these changes happen.
Breaking news.
A bombshell.
Today is a turning point. Today was historically bad for President Trump.
Today was a turning point.
A turning point.
We're at a turning point here.
The beginning of the end for the Trump presidency.
We have another bombshell.
Mike Pence might have to assume the office of the presidency.
Rumblings of the word impeachment.
Breaking news.
Another bombshell out of the White House.
I believe this is the beginning of the end.
I do too.
It's really the beginning of the end.
He may be feeling the walls closing in on him.
All the walls closing in on him.
The walls closing in on him.
Breaking news, a new bombshell.
One astrologer says this means the beginning of the end for President Donald Trump.
Trump will resign.
Trump is going to resign.
Is this the tipping point? I know we've said it over and over.
You think this is a tipping point?
And over and over.
This is a
tipping point.
And over. Breaking news, President Trump off the rails.
It was the beginning of the end today.
The beginning of the end.
Breaking news tonight, new bombshell. This is the beginning of the end.
The beginning of the end.
The walls are closing in.
The walls closing in.
The wall's closing in.
Breaking overnight bombshell.
This is a very dramatic day, and I think it might be near a tipping point. Do you think this is a tipping point?
December 1st, 2017, you can mark it down. This is the day that everything changed.
The beginning of the end?
Beginning of the end.
The beginning of the end. The beginning of the end.
The beginning of the...
We begin tonight with the bombshell. Donald Trump is in a lot of trouble.
Trump is in trouble.
The president will resign.
Another hour, another bombshell.
This is a tipping point.
Trump's going down.
This president could be impeached.
Resignation. I don't think this president is going to serve out his term.
Mr. Trump will not serve out his term.
He will not serve out his term.
No way, no how.
Breaking news.
Absolute bombshell.
Donald Trump is not. He's done. And it's over.
It's over.
The wall's closing in.
The wall's closing in. This is going to be the Achilles heel.
Breaking news tonight. I expect Trump to depart.
This week will be the watershed week.
Trump is in big trouble.
Trump's in a lot of trouble.
It's a sign of a terrified old man who feels the
walls
closing in.
The walls
are increasingly
Closing in on him.
tonight. The walls
are closing in.
If your email inbox is out of control and you've given up sorting it out, a Baltimore company thinks it has a solution for you. Could this be the end of email overload?
Could this be the end of email overload?
Could this be the end of email overload?
Could this
be the end of email overload?
Could this be the end of email overload? Could this be the end of email overload? Could this be the end of email overload? Could this be the end of email overload?
Could this be the end of email overload?
Could this be the end of email overload? Could this be the end of email overload? Could this be the end of your email overload? Could this be the end of 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 email
overload?
Could this be the end of email overload?
Final days of the campaign can get a little salty.
The final days of the campaign can get a little salty.
The final days of the campaign can get a little salty.
The final days of the campaign can get a little salty.
The final days of the campaign can get a little salty.
The final days of the campaign can get a little salty.
The final days of the campaign can get a little salty. The final days of the campaign can get a little salty.
The final days of the campaign can get a little salty. The final days of the campaign can get a little salty.
You probably noticed the final days of the campaign have been, well, you might call them just a little salty.
Show thanks. New on Sunrise, Frank Ocean tells a major fast food chain to buzz off. And which celeb peed in a glass jar?
Frank Ocean tells a major fast food chain to buzz off. And which celeb peed in a glass jar?
Frank Ocean tells a major
Fast food chain to buzz off. And which celeb peed in a glass jar?
Frank Ocean tells a major fast food chain to buzz off. And which celeb peed in a glass jar? Interesting question. Frank Ocean telling a major fast food chain to buzz off. And which celeb peed in a glass jar?
Frank Ocean tells a major fast food chain to buzz off. And which celeb peed in a glass jar?
Frank Ocean tells a major fast food chain to buzz off. And which celeb peed in a glass jar?
Frank Ocean tells a major fast food chain to buzz off. And which celeb actually peed in a glass jar? Frank Ocean tells a major fast food chain to buzz off. Also, an interesting story here. What celebrity would pee in a glass jar? Frank Ocean telling a major fast food chain to buzz off. And which celebrity did something in a glass jar?
Frank Ocean tells a major fast food chain to buzz off. And which celeb used the potty in a glass jar?
Frank Ocean tells a major fast food chain to buzz off.
And which celeb used the glass jar for the restroom?
Frank Ocean tells a major fast food chain to buzz off. And which celebrity used the restroom in a glass jar? Let's say that. Frank Ocean tells a major fast food chain to buzz off.
And which celeb used a glass jar as a restroom?
Who are you really shopping for this holiday season? It's okay, you can admit it, if you've bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
Well, it's okay. You can admit it if you have bought an item or 2 or maybe 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it. You bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself. It's okay, you can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it, Todd. If you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself. It's okay, you can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or maybe 10 for yourself. It's okay, you can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it if you bought 1 or 2 or maybe 3 or 4, maybe even 10 items for yourself. It's okay, you can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself. It's okay, you can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or maybe 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it if you bought maybe an item or 2 or 10 for yourself. Is it okay? You can admit it. If you bought an item or 2 or 3 or 10 for yourself, it's okay, you can admit it. If you bought an It's okay. You could if you bought an item or 2 or 10 for you. It's okay. If you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself. It's okay. If you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself. It's okay. You can admit it. It's okay. You can admit it if you bought yourself with 1 or 2 or 10 things for
Yourself, because a lot of people do it.
It's Cyber Monday, a day on the retail calendar that can be enjoyed from a desk or the couch.
Enjoy it from a desk or a couch. Enjoy it from a desk or maybe the couch. Enjoy it from a desk or the couch. Enjoy it from a desk or the couch. Enjoy it from a desk or even the couch. Enjoy it from a desk or the couch. From a desk or the couch. From a desk or the couch. From a desk or a couch. From a desk or your couch. From a desk or the couch. From a desk or the couch. From a desk or the couch. From a desk or a couch. From your desk or the couch. From a 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 desk or even the couch. From a desk or the couch. Enjoy it from a desk or a couch. From a desk or the couch. From a desk or the couch.
Or wherever you like, as long as you got internet.
Well, if you filled up your gas tank lately, then you don't need us to tell you that gas prices are back on the rise.
You don't need us to tell you that gas prices are back on the rise.
You don't need us to tell you that gas prices are back on the rise.
You don't need us to tell you that gas prices are back on the rise.
You don't need us to tell you that gas prices are back on the rise.
You don't need us to tell you that gas prices are back on the rise.
You don't need us to tell you that gas prices are back on the rise.
You don't need us to tell you that gas prices are back on the rise.
You don't need us to tell you gas prices are back on the rise.
You don't need us to tell you that gas prices are back on the rise.
You don't need us to tell you that gas prices are back on the rise.
You don't need us to tell you gas prices are back on the rise.
You don't need us to tell you that gas prices are back on the rise.
You don't need us to tell you gas prices
are on the rise.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is
priceless, especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
Well, child's happiness is priceless, right? Especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday. A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on their birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially when it comes to their birthday.
Absolutely. A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday. A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday. A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday. A child's smile is priceless, especially on a birthday. A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
You know, a child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday. A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
You like that?
In consumer news, economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring
out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take some of the spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take the spring out of the step of the Easter Bunny this year.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Did I say that right?
Just say it right.
Yeah, baby.
So I scream, you scream. You know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, we all know the rest. I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, y'all know the rest of it, right? I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, and you know the rest. I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest. So I scream, you scream, well, I think you know the rest. I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, and everybody knows the rest. I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream,
And you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men and women created by you know the thing.